Welcome everybody to our today's talk in archaeological science of the HEAS, the Human Evolution and Archaeological Science seminar series. Today we are here at the Institute for Prehistory at the University of Vienna, and we will hear our today's talk by Martinon-Torres. I just want to give you some short overview, some short words about his work. Martinon-Torres is Pitt Rivers Professor of Archaeological Science at the University of Cambridge, and he is a fellow of the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research. In his work, he focuses on archaeological science, archaeology, and the history of technology to investigate how past societies developed and organized complex technological practices. Before he joined Cambridge in 2018, he spent over a decade at the University College of London, where he established himself as a leading figure in archaeometallurgy and the scientific study of ancient materials. Martinon-Torres' research focuses on the technological, the social, and the cultural dimensions of material productions in the past societies. His work examines the manufacturing, the circulation, the meaning of materials such as gold, silver, and copper alloys. By combining laboratory techniques with archaeological fieldwork, experimental reconstruction, and historical analysis, he explores how technological knowledge was generated, transmitted, and embedded in social structures. Today he will present us the results of his ongoing ERC Advanced Grant Project, Reverse Engineering Collective Action. This project investigates how technologically sophisticated production systems can emerge and be sustained in societies that lack strong hierarchical and political institutions. Beyond this very impressive project, he has led many numerous interdisciplinary archaeometallurgical projects addressing various topics like metallurgy, ancient metallurgy, or also technological innovation of early societies. He has a very impressive, extensive publication record that reflects his interdisciplinary scope of his work. He has authored and edited 9 books, about 180 articles, which covers various topics from the Bronze Age to analysis of materials associated with the terracotta army in China, just to mention some of his very important works. And with this short summary, I'm at the end of the introduction, and I immediately give the word to Marcus and say thank you for your today's talk.
Thank you, Matthias, for your very kind and detailed introduction, and thank you everyone for having me. I'm delighted to be joining you today, even if, of course, disappointed that unfortunately I cannot join you in person. I hope to be able to address that soon. But it was just a complicated week for a variety of reasons. But I hope, even if remotely, I'll be able to share with you some highlights of this ongoing reverse action project that Matthias was telling you about, trying to provide some archaeological insights from pre-Hispanic Colombia about how complex technologies can be sustained through collective action, through cooperation. And I'm going to try to do those highlights by giving you some 3 different quick case studies from different areas of Colombia and different materials. But I thought I would first try to contextualize these more theoretically, but quite briefly, to explain where I am coming from and where we are coming from as a team. As Matthias was saying, I have been privileged to study complex technologies, a lot of gold work, but also other technologies that we might call luxurious ones, if you like, in a variety of contexts, from China through Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And I think something that can be said, as I said, from special gold work, but also other special artifacts and materials. They can be I don't know, very ornate textiles or pottery or exotic semi-precious stones and so on. In archaeology and also in general public readings, we tend to rather loosely associate these kinds of materials and technologies to concepts such as power, exotism, accumulation, wealth, the individual, and oversimplifying. I know we tend to explicitly or implicitly interpret these materials as the evidence for individuals who are trying to mark their power, who use these commodities to reinforce that power and authority, to display their status, to accumulate wealth that often extract out of others, etc., etc. We're all familiar with these narratives where we find, I don't know, a burial where there is gold or other special artifacts, and we immediately wonder who was the powerful individual, typically a man who had the power and the wealth to accumulate all of these, etc. And these narratives may well be correct in many instances, but I would argue that not always, and therefore we should be a bit more cautious before making those assumptions. And there is another assumption that is very commonly accepted, almost unquestioned, that is even more irritating, which is illustrated with this map. If you ask anyone, maybe in the audience today or in the general public, to name some pre-Hispanic civilizations, they will typically come up with those three that you see in the map. And this, of course, immediately begs the questions of what happens in the rest of the map. Were people there uncivilized? And in particular, in the area where I've been conducting a lot of work with a large team, the area of Colombia and surrounding regions, they typically appear named in academic literature as the intermediate area, and the social structures there classified as intermediate societies. They are rarely, if ever, called civilizations. Now, why is that? And obviously, as soon as you ask the question, you see that the answer is quite remarkable, because what makes these areas allegedly uncivilized is that they never had central, top-down, coercive states. They never had kings, they never had presidents or pharaohs. We have tended to assume that because of that, they were less civilized. And this is, of course, questionable. That correlation of special materials with one individual who accumulates power, and that idea that civilization is constrained to societies which have state or imperial structures. Now, all of these two core assumptions that I have just simplified or laid out for you can be challenged immediately if you visit any museum, or in particular, the one I'm showing you here is the Museo del Oro, the Gold Museum in Bogota. Here we have 50,000 gold objects as well as ceramics, emeralds, textiles, etc., that illustrate immediately that in the societies that inhabited Colombia in the pre-Hispanic period, they were completely capable of sophisticated, complex technological systems that were sustained for centuries. They had, of course, artistic, if you like, sensitivity or certainly religious inspiration. They were arguably as civilized as any of their neighbors, and materially they certainly look as complex, and therefore they immediately demonstrate that you can have and sustain these complex technologies in the absence of top-down coercive authorities, in the absence of somebody who is extracting labor and wealth, who's forcing others to produce these materials for their own aggrandizement. And these, in a nutshell, is the background to the Reverse Action Project. The Reverse Action Project is concerned with understanding how complex technologies can be sustained in stateless societies. So we're looking at social structures where we have no evidence of states and where we are not hesitant, I should use a stronger word, we are against the idea that these should be considered intermediate societies. The idea that those stateless societies are in a stagnant, underdeveloped way towards becoming states. What we should study is how they function without being states and how they can be sustained for centuries in that particular form of variety of social organizations. And we're focusing particularly on complex technologies, that is, those that require unusual investment of skills or labor or knowledge in order to be created and sustained. And we're doing all of these through reverse engineering. That is, We are studying the end products, the artifacts, the materials, the archaeological realities. And from that, we are trying to work backwards to understand the technologies and the social organizations that led and sustained these technologies. And particularly, we are paying attention to collective action, to forms of cooperation that may have enabled this. There is, of course, in the last 20 or so years, there has been a lot of developments in archaeology and anthropology, not just us, that have focused on different ways of governance, different ways in which stateless societies can be organized, that go beyond the simplistic understanding that they are all chiefdoms that are somewhere in between the hunter-gatherer bands and the more developed states. We admit, we accept, we are interested in a plurality of ways in which people and resources can be governed, which don't always unnecessarily fall in a single unilinear trajectory that goes from simple to complex, from uncivilized to civilized, if you like. So there has been a lot of interesting proposals that rather than trying to go on these single linear arrangement, maybe looking at how resources can be organized or classified along various axes, from low to high sustractability, from easy to difficult exclusion, and so on. Other people will try and map social structures depending on how individual actors and political elites range from inclusive to exclusive, from collective to individualistic. So different ways of studying, classifying, comparing social structures that make no assumptions about what the end of the game is, whether they should be evolving all of them to a particular form of social organization. So all of this, of course, is revealing more colorful past and present societies, a lot more diversity, and it's raising new questions, really, and new agendas for archaeology and anthropology, for the study of the past and for the present. An additional concept that's particularly relevant to much of what I'll be talking about today is that idea of the costly technologies. Sometimes we use a shorthand luxury for them, even though these may have confusing connotations. And here I'm focusing, sometimes we talk about complex technologies as well. What we mean, as I said earlier, is those technologies that require exceptional investment of raw materials, labor, or organization. And we define them, therefore, from the production side of things. So what are the costs, human, material, intellectual, of sustaining these technologies? But we make no assumptions about the consumption. By this, I mean that we make no assumptions about the social structure that led to those technologies. We're making no assumptions about who those people were working for, who those materials were being used by, or collected by, or appropriated by, if there was anyone. So these are some of our broader theoretical frameworks, and I need to highlight in particular, like so many other people working on collective action, the work of Elinor Ostrom. Professor Ostrom was the first female to be granted the Nobel Prize of Economy because of her sustained work that demonstrated very convincingly that the so-called tyranny of the commons is a fallacy. What she demonstrated was that, perhaps contrary to expectations, if you let a community, if you allow them to manage resources collectively, horizontally, without any top-down administration, they can be sustained in for very long periods without it necessarily leading to overexploitation, to selfish individuals who will exploit the system for their individual advantage. So this has led to a myriad of archaeological and anthropological works that emphasize the idea of the community, how communities can self-regulate without any top-down government, to voluntarily cooperate to achieve shared goals, to share the benefits in what other people often emphasized as heterarchical societies, as opposed to the more commonly discussed hierarchical societies. There's a lot of terms here that we could unpick and elaborate on, but hopefully this provides you enough of a background to understand where we are coming from and what we are trying to achieve. In essence, the Reverse Action project is trying to address a single question. That's the question. The archaeological evidence shows that technological systems of high complexity did exist in societies without coercive elites and without capitalist markets. But how was this possible? So how can complex technological systems be sustained when you don't have a top-down authority, when you don't have a capitalist incentive? So this is in a nutshell what we're trying to explore, and to guide much of our research, we've laid out a couple of relatively simple but hopefully inspiring hypotheses. The first one has to do with diversity. What we claim is that sustainability of these systems, where there was no top-down centralized authority, sustainability relied on diversity. Diversity in the supply of raw materials, diversity in the access to knowledge, diversity in the organization of production, which most probably included cross-craft interaction. The idea here is that when you don't have a top authority who can force others to work for them, who can make sure there is supply of raw materials and knowledge from attached specialists effectively, what we hypothesized is that knowledge was made more robust by being shared horizontally. Many people had access to technical knowledge, many people participated in technological activities, and this should be seen in an archaeological record that should reflect that diversity of raw materials, of techniques, of approaches, of people. A lot of peripheral participation and learning, if you like. The other hypothesis has to do with the motivation for these complex and luxurious systems. And here we emphasize the role of ritual. What we claim is that, as a hypothesis, ritual helps sustain complex technologies. That is, where we didn't have an elite demanding those complex technologies, it was a ritual motivation that led people to work on these often seemingly useless technologies. But also, and related to this, the connection between technology and ritual also made these technologies more conservative. This is based on the idea that rituals are by definition repetitive. That's how we understand them. That's how we recognize them and how they become socially meaningful. But once you ritualize technology, you are going to conserve it because you're going to make it repetitive too. So these are our key hypotheses under the overarching question, and our main study area is Colombia. We have a few areas where we've been doing other studies for comparative purposes, but our primary data, where a lot of our researchers in Colombia and here in the UK are working on, are in different regions of Colombia. Colombia is a great case study region because within a single country we have, well, Colombia is the #1 country for biodiversity in the world. We have mountains of over 5,000 meters, but also coasts, Pacific and Caribbean, Amazonian. So we have all kinds of ecosystems and all kinds of social systems. And it's important that we emphasize that they are not all the same, even if I don't have the time to go into individual details now. What's interesting is we have a lot of forms of social structure, but all of them are stateless. We have no evidence for kings or pharaohs in any of them. And even though we have evidence of what has been called chiefs or caciques, the archaeological evidence, as well as a review of historical sources, is increasingly revealing these chiefs, where they did exist, as servants to the community. So these may have been people with particular prestige, with particular authority, but they were not people with coercive power. They were people whose responsibility was to serve the community. In particular, in this region, where the Muisca are, around Bogota here, where there has been a lot more extensive recent research, we've increasingly come to understand that them, like other Chibcha-speaking communities, had no top-down authority, like little kings. So those little kings and tyrants that the Europeans described in their sources, because it fit their exploitative aims, were simply not there. And they had nothing to do with those portraits that the Europeans tried to paint of them. So in each of these regions, we've been looking at different technological systems involving goldwork, emeralds, ornate ceramics, complex textiles. And what I thought I would do today was to give you some individual case studies from some regions, each of them focusing on a different kind of technology. This is not quite how we are doing the project. We're looking at several technologies in each of the regions so we can then compare and synthesize. But just to give you some snapshots, I'm going to talk first about landscape management in the Thenú area in the north. I will then look at gold work in the Muisca region, and then we'll move to the southern Cordillera, the Serranía de Nariño, near Ecuador, where we'll be talking about ceramics. Starting then first with the Mompox region in the north in the Caribbean plains. This is an extraordinarily interesting region for a lot of reasons, but the one that I'm highlighting today is the one you're seeing here. As you can see, this landscape is crisscrossed with all of these channels, all of these canals and ridges that span as much as 500,000 hectares. This is an extraordinarily large area that has been all of it anthropically modified to create these channels and ridges. But let me give you a little bit of context first. So this is where we are in Colombia. This is a very low-lying region, and this means that during the wet season, which is very long, the whole area can be flooded for several months at a time, which of course makes it very difficult for people to live in and for any subsistence activities to take place. Now, this remains a problem today, and the way in which the government, the top-down authority today, largely tries to deal with the problem is by blocking the water. Dams are constantly built, and dams get periodically broken so that large areas get flooded with natural and often human disasters associated. So this is the way in which the government still to this day, largely, with some small exceptions, still insists on trying to tackle this problem with only arguably very limited success. If we look at the pre-Hispanic past, what they were doing is the opposite. Instead of blocking the water, they were working with the water. So they created these extraordinary systems of ridges and canals that allow the water to flow through the environment in a more controlled way, providing also these canals where fishing would be easier, creating loads of clay deposition that will create more fertile soils. And also in the ridges, not only they could move, but they could also, of course, grow a variety of crops for their subsistence. So these canals that cover, as I said, hundreds and hundreds of square kilometers are still perceptible from the air, also on the ground, but particularly from the air with aerial photography, LiDAR, and so on. And they have been known for decades, but typically interpreted as the result of an engineering feat that could only have been achieved with top-down organization, again, with some kind of political leader, potentially exploiting slaves, who were all organized from the top down to create these systems. But of course, in light with recent developments, we've been problematizing this and wondering, is it really necessary to have a top-down coercive authority to create these effective systems? So what we have done is select a study region of 500 hectares, and we have, based on aerial photography, digital elevation models, and other aerial information, we've tried to create a very detailed map of all of these canals and bridges, water bodies, as well as these areas that you see here, which are raised platforms where the houses, where people would have lived. Having created this vector map, we can now quantify with a lot more resolution, well, the amount, the length, the width of all of these canals, and we can do various forms of spatial analysis that have allowed us to classify them in terms of their length and orientation, and therefore understand a bit better how the whole system was built. We have differentiated different types of different clusters or different types of canals. Some of them 1 and 2 very long, hundreds of meters, no doubt requiring involvement of loads of people to create, certainly beyond the individual domestic level. Others smaller, often radiating from them. So loads of interesting things, but the one I would highlight today, the one we focused on, was our attempt to quantify the labor involved, the labor required to produce these impressive systems. And for these, we had to make some assumptions, but we tried to be super conservative. So based on the excavated data, we've allowed 500 square meters for a house where only 5 people live. So that's quite a generous allowance. It's based on excavation of where the huts floors typically appearing in the surrounding areas that are unbuilt. From that, we've estimated a population density for this area, which would be around 1,700 people. And we are assuming, again, very conservative, that only 50% of the population would work. We know generally, certainly based on ethnographic examples, that more people work. But again, we're trying to be conservative. Also being conservative, we've assumed that a single individual will be able to move approximately between 2.5 and 5 square meters of soil per day. This is again based on ethnographic and experimental studies. We've considered archaeological excavations to estimate the depth of these canals. We've calculated how many kilometers of canals have been built, etc., etc. And with those parameters, we've estimated these labor costs. There's a lot of numbers here, but the one I want to highlight is basically this one in the corner. So for the total system of 50 hectares that we're looking at here, those 355,000 cubic meters of soil that would have been moved, they can be built by a small community, by 800 people working together in between 3 to 6 weeks. So they could have built all of that in a single dry season if they worked together. They could renew this system every generation by just putting in a few days of work every year. Now, this does not demonstrate that this system was built by collective action, but it makes it credible. It makes it plausible that, impressive as this seems, when you consider the possibility of cooperative labor and how the system grew organically from various hubs of people until they all merged into one another, into the system that we see today. This is possible without state intervention. And this is really important, not only in terms of how we understand the past, but potentially and importantly to tell policymakers in the present that this is feasible and that if they allowed communities to self-manage in this way, the problems of flooding might be less severe. That's one perhaps for another day. So that's one of the case studies that I wanted to show with you. We're now going to move to a different region of Colombia and a different kind of technology. We are now in the Eastern Highlands, as I said, the plains, the high plains near what today is Bogota. And I want to present a single case study from a single site, the site of Nueva Esperanza. Nueva Esperanza is a Muisca archaeological site that is basically one of the largest, if not the largest, archaeological excavation in the history of Colombia. We were lucky to be there just last week. Though we've been working with this material for quite a while now. It's an extraordinary site because it allows us to see 2,000 years of life in Muisca village. Archaeologists have excavated hundreds of houses that can be mapped very well, around 4,000 burials, and therefore an extraordinarily rich material record of how life and death was managed, way beyond what I can tell you today. But I'm going to focus on the gold work because gold is, of course, interesting if you ask me, but also because gold is one of those luxurious materials, if you like, that are typically associated to these individual power, etc., all of those traditional narratives of state organizations. So these are some of the 200 gold artifacts recovered there. As you can see, the vast majority of them are body ornaments. They can be earrings, nose rings, beads that could have been used for necklaces or similar. This is a pectoral, this is another pectoral, and so on. And before we go into the details of the technical study, something that's worth highlighting is that all the gold used at the site of Nueva Esperanza is imported. So this, of course, adds to the exotism, to the value, potentially to those traditional narratives, but we'll come back to this, of course, later. What this map shows is a zoom in area of, well, here you have Colombia, and in yellow you have the main mapped gold sources that would have been accessible, relatively easy to exploit in the pre-Hispanic period. There's loads of those in Colombia, but funnily enough, in the Muisca area, there are no known natural gold sources. So the white dots is where we find Muisca gold work, including the site of Nueva Esperanza. And as you can see, all the gold sources, all the gold would have been obtained through trade or interaction with other non-Muisca communities. If you look at these artifacts in detail, as my colleague Agnese Benzonelli has been doing, what you're going to find, and as well as Rosie Crawford, what you're going to find is, well, a lot of different complex technical systems. And I thought I would illustrate that with these idiosyncratic beads that we find in Nueva Esperanza, but also in a number of Muisca assemblages. So these are identical or very similar looking gold beads that, as you can see, are slightly concave in shape, and they would have been made with the assistance of these so-called stone matrices. These are fine-grained black stones where you can see in relief carved the shape of whatever beads you want to do. They are like 2 or 3 centimeters, sometimes 1 in length, not very big. But these stones, contrary to what one might think, were not used for embossing metal on them directly. This is something we know from European Middle Ages or even earlier, where stone matrices are used to facilitate the embossing mechanically of metal to give it shape. This was a lot more complex and peculiar. The way in which these would be made was using wax first. So these stone matrices are used for casting beads with the lost wax technique. So first you would apply beeswax to whatever surface you are using here, depending on the pattern that you want to cast today. You then extract your wax model and apply another one, and you can create a series of wax beads that you can then chain to one another using these tabs that you see here. And then subsequently, you would create clay or clay and charcoal dust mold around those wax models. Once the clay is set, you would heat this to melt the wax out. So you have a negative of whatever shape you have, in this case, all of these beads. And you would then proceed to cast your metal, your gold alloy into this mold, break the mold, extract the beads, hopefully looking fine, and then break, snap broken, and clean the individual beads. This is a rather complex technology, and one we have not seen anywhere else in the world, as far as we know, when we've looked. Nothing done in this way of using the wax on the stone molds, etc. Well, what I've just described. But it's just one example of a very idiosyncratic gold working technique that we document in Nueva Esperanza as well as in other places. And we can look at individual artifacts under the microscope and reveal a great variety of other techniques. So some objects have been made by hammering gold in relatively simple ways. Others have on the surface casting dendrites, which show they were cooling in probably a preheated mold after casting. So they have a peculiar texture that's left in this way without any additional work. In other cases, as you see here, the gold has been polished very finely, so the surface texture is completely different. You also see, incidentally, the very different colors corresponding to different alloy compositions. This is just to illustrate some of the technical diversity that you see here. This is on the bottom left, an example of an object that has been cast hollow, but inside they left a charcoal core, which is a particular way of casting that's different from massive solid castings that we have also at the site. We also have here on the bottom right, it's not very well preserved, but it's an object that clearly had underwent depletion gilding. This is a complex way of getting a surface that's more golden on an object that is made of a relatively copper-rich alloy, but through surface treatment, they make the surface more golden. Also, here in the middle, we have what we might call a casting error. All of these gaps should have been left open, but the metal flow accidentally entered those spaces. And this is again to highlight that there are some objects that are arguably made in more skillful ways than others, or certainly with higher investment of labor and knowledge. So what we have, in essence, without going into every individual detail, is what one could argue are a variety of technologies, that is, a variety of ways of making metal objects, and a variety of skills investment. I mean, compare, say, this ring, which is just a hammer rod, to this cast pectoral, to objects with depletion, gilding, etc. All of these, to us, is strongly suggestive of, if you like, different gold working traditions, different ways of making gold work with different learning skills, different attitudes, etc., different tools, different techniques. So a variety of groups of people, all of which are making gold. So this is not what one might expect of a single specialist workshop producing for an elite. And this idea of diversity is also apparent if we look at the actual composition of this gold work. Here on the left, we have a ternary diagram of those 200 objects and their compositions colored by typology. So this would be gold, silver, copper, and what you have is a great variety of copper to gold ratios, so alloys in all kinds of proportions. We don't have a lot of dots towards the silver corner of the diagram, and this is because the Muisca did not exploit silver. So all the silver that we have is silver that's naturally present in the gold. But what we have is a great variety, non-standardized way of mixing copper with argentiferous gold. No clear patterns. What we see is diversity. Again, what seems to be a diversity of ways of doing. If we arrange the dots chronologically, we do see an expansion in the range of alloys in the middle period, in the early Muisca period. But then again, it's also true that this is the period for which we have the largest sample. But bar for this expansion of alloys from the early Muisca period, as you can see, we have no clustering that we might find in other cultures. What we have is a big diversity in alloy compositions. Nothing constrained, nothing habitual, nothing that has been forced onto them. And to go farther with this sense of diversity, we've started looking at the potential sources of the gold. Now, I said earlier that the Muisca had to bring the gold from elsewhere because it does not occur naturally. And so we've begun to do trace element analysis on a number of these gold objects. We're also doing copper, silver, and lead isotopes of them in collaboration with Juniata College, but the results are still pending. But what the initial results are beginning to show, as this cluster diagram here illustrates, is that there is a variety of gold sources. Based on their trace elements, based on their geochemical impurities, there's strong indications that the Muisca were obtaining gold not from one source, but from a variety of them. This is consistent with ethnohistorical, but also growing archaeological evidence that the Muisca were constantly exchanging things at all kinds of scales with loads of other Muisca and non-Muisca communities. They were doing what you might call today diplomatic gifting or exchange of goods. So no markets in the way we see them today as purely economic, transactional, if you like, but a lot of exchange of all materials, including gold, that was clearly traded both as finished objects and as gold dust, as gold nuggets. This was a way of, again, horizontally establishing bonds among communities and facilitating access to gold that was frequently offered in votive locations as ritual offerings, but also occasionally buried with individuals, as we see at the site of Nueva Esperanza. So again, not what we might expect, where we have a top-down authority extracting from a particular mine that is controlled by the government, etc. The system is completely different here. Who were those individuals who were being buried with gold? Again, here the evidence is still beginning to emerge. Some of the analyses are ongoing, but we can begin to show you some interesting results, particularly based on the diet of those individuals associated to gold work. So here you have the initial results of carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis of the population from Nueva Esperanza. Highlighted in green, you have humans, then a variety of animals. But in essence, the highlights are that everyone have a diet that is rich in protein and C4, corn, but of particular relevance to this talk today is that based on the sample that we have so far, there are no significant difference between individuals associated with gold and individuals without gold, just as there are no significant differences between males and females. So we're now expanding the analysis, but what we see here, yeah, we see a few people with higher nitrogen isotope values. These are all infants. Because of breastfeeding, of course, they have higher protein, higher nitrogen isotope values. But you can see no overall difference between a group associated to gold that would have access to better food, more protein, whatever. And this is consistent with other studies on other Muisca sites, where it has been shown that there's no obvious difference in health, pathologies, etc., between people who are buried with gold and people who are not buried with gold. So yes, some individuals are being marked with gold for whatever reason. They may have been special in some way. Of course, others may have been marked with other materials. But again, we don't have any strong evidence that there are individuals accumulating a lot of wealth who would have particular privilege, power, etc. And this makes sense because we are talking about the Muisca, a society where there's not even, from what we know from Chibcha-speaking, the anthropology of Chibcha-speaking communities today, they don't even have a strong or any separation, well, not as strong, let's put it this way, separation between humans and non-humans. Their ontologies don't really allow for that accumulation of private property. And so we need to understand this in a way that's very different from our usual framework. And so, yes, there are individuals buried with gold, but let's not immediately assume that they are super wealthy chiefs who are exploiting others. In fact, most of the tombs with gold have one or two artifacts, not more. And finally, returning to the gold itself, something that's potentially interesting too is the continuity over time. At the site of Nueva Esperanza, we have the beauty of a very long temporal sequence where we can, through radiocarbon and stratigraphic dates, arrange this gold work in order. And you can see that some techniques, such as these matrix-assisted casting, we have in a sequence spanning 2,000 years, practically unchanged. And we contend that this has to do with the ritual association to the gold, because gold is ritually constrained, it's part of offerings, it's part of what the community does to sustain itself. It is therefore conservative. What we see in Nueva Esperanza is also consistent with what we have been observing in votive gold work from the Muisca. As part of the project, we have collected all the radiocarbon dates available for gold work in pre-Hispanic Colombia. And this is an example here, not from Nueva Esperanza. These are votive offerings, but you can see practically identical objects, not just in style, but in their technology. They are all lost wax cast with a hollow core made with charcoal. And in the most conservative way, we still have 400 years at least of the use of this technology, practically unchanged. So all of this, we think, is an indication of that technology that's very diverse, but at the same time, very conservative, very similar from the earlier to the late periods, quite possibly because of that ritual association. And this was case study number 2. We've talked about irrigation channels not irrigation, raised field agriculture, in the Fenú region. We've talked about gold in the Muisca, and now we move to our final region. We're moving far south to talk about ceramics in the Nariño Highlands. So we're now here near the border with Ecuador, and indeed, culturally, a lot of this material culture that I'm showing to you today continues into what today is Ecuador. We're focusing on ceramics materials. These are covered in a variety of tombs of which we know hundreds nowadays, that are your typical shaft and chamber burials. The depth of the shaft varies from between 1 or 2 meters to something exceptionally 20 or even 30 meters of depth. But again, before we interpret these tombs as belonging to a particular elite, we should remember there are hundreds of them. So it's not 1 or 2 chiefly princely graves. The other thing to note, even if in passing, is that the materials we find in these tombs lend themselves very well to the study of cross-craft interaction. This is something we are working on at the moment, not something I'll be talking about today, but just to illustrate those potential transfers of techniques and motifs between materials, we have an example of pottery here, which is what we are talking about, what I'm talking about now. But this pottery has been decorated by negative paint, by resist paint. I will spend a moment talking about that in a second. And this technique is exactly conceptually the same as you use for gold work. The colors are the same. The patterns that you see in gold work and ceramics, you see it in textiles. And indeed, some of these imitate natural materials in terms of their polish and textures. So these sorts of transfer of techniques and motifs between different crafts we are exploring because they could support the idea of the production workshops as not being specialized, but rather, again, informal areas where ideas, possibly tools, certainly concepts about how you create material culture could have been shared among many individuals with a lot of peripheral participation, as I was saying earlier. But focusing on the pottery, and just to highlight a couple of methods and results, we've been sampling ceramics from a range of sites, and these ceramics have been historically classified in 3 types of wares: Capuli, Piartal, and Tusa. You can see examples of on the left. Capuli being always dominated by negative paint, Piartal having a mixture of negative and positive paint, and Tusa having positive paint, only positive decoration. I thought I would include a word about negative decoration for those of you who may not be familiar with the term. What you have on the left are a few pictures of a recent workshop with a community in Chuchala in Nariño, who've been extraordinarily helpful and informative in facilitating our understanding of these technologies and how these decorations took place. But that's one for another day. But basically, just so we understand that negative decoration, you have an example of a copa or a bowl here, which has red and black paint. So these you would paint first in red, but the black paint was not painted directly in the areas that you see here. Instead, what they would do is selectively cover areas of the pot. What we see here, yellow, that would be covered with another slip of unbaked clay or wax, so a resist material that covers parts of the bowl. And then everything was smoked black or painted black before then removing the yellow negative or resist material, so that in the end we have selected areas looking black. So it's a peculiar approach to decorating pottery that we also see, interestingly, in metals, but not something that I'm going to focus on more today. What I would like to show instead is how we've been doing also similar to the metals, trying to understand their sources, the selection of raw materials, their technological systems, etc. And to show you a couple of highlights. First, based on the XRF analysis of large numbers of them, what we find is that they largely form a cloud, which is very consistent with local clays. I'm not showing that here, but what we're now increasingly seeing is that for each site that we sample, we have a cluster of clays that are mostly clearly local. So the suggestion is that for a lot of the pottery that we find in each site, the supply would be local. They all have access to clays. Of course, unlike the gold, access to relevant, suitable clays locally is a lot simpler in this area. But what we find interesting, and you can see a slight differences in the chemistry, particularly from the Capuli to then Piartal and Tuthla. This is mostly noticeable when you look at the microstructure, uh, when you look at the ash content. What you see is that over time, we seem to have an increase in the amount of volcanic ash placed, mixed with the clay. But we think this may well be a natural phenomenon, simply showing that we have the very same clays, but different volcanic events that are enriching our clays with more and more ashes. So that's the only difference. We're now actually analyzing these tephra, these volcanic ashes, to see whether we can refine both the dating and the provenance of these ceramics. But in essence, the message is they're using a variety of local clays, really. Of perhaps more interest is the geometric morphometric analysis that we have been conducting. For these, even though we have a variety of pottery types, we are focusing on these bowl-shaped copas. And the geometric morphometric analysis of cross sections that we extracted from 3D models allows us to, well, compare, see recurrent shapes, compare them based on their wear, etc. So this is all of our sample. Now we have the dots colored by wear, and you can see how Piartal and Tuthla are very similar to one another. Tuthla perhaps more standardized, more consistent shapes, and so on. But what is of particular relevant to our study and also more novel in terms of methodology is that we're not just looking at variability between pots, but also the variability within pots, if you like. Because we have 3D models of these ceramics, we can look at things such as how the wall thickness varies around the circle. And so we can look at how uniform the thickness of a pot is within that pot by comparing loads of measurements and then calculating, for example, the coefficient of variation. So in each of these columns here, you have one pot, and you can immediately see, so these are all normalized to wall thickness, but what you can see is some of them where wall thickness varies quite substantially, and others where the wall thickness is a lot more uniform. And this, together with other proxies, we would take as an indication of a pot that is made by a more skillful maker, one that knows how to. These are all handmade; they're not thrown on the wheel. At least the vast majority of them. Maybe some of the later ones are. But what you can see here, we think, is indication of different motor habits or skills, reflected in some ceramics that are more uniform in their wall thickness than others. Similarly, we can look at the circularity or the roundness of these pots, and you can see in these diagrams at the bottom what we mean by circularity and roundness. And what you can see is, on the one hand, that from Capuli to Tuthla, there seems to be an increase in circularity, while incidentally for the Capuli we have higher roundness. This may be reflective of different community-wide techniques, that is, changes maybe from slab to coil to wheel or among them. I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily the case, but what is particularly relevant here and what I would like to highlight is not so much the trend between wares, but the fact that within wares we have quite a lot of variability. So again, the idea that one potter is very bad at making circular pots and another one who is very good. Of course, we are assuming that the ideal bowl they're trying to make is very circular, symmetric, rotationally, even wall thickness, etc. But what we see is, we think, a variety of motor habits, a variety of skills. And this appears, again, most conspicuously in this assessment of intravessel variation using geometric morphometrics. This is a paper that I don't know if it's, well, we've seen the proofs, it should appear any day now, where we've done something that we think has quite a lot of potential for ceramic analysis. So we're not looking at, so we've 3D scanned these ceramics, and then we have sectioned them 36 times, every 10 degrees. And then what we do is to compare all of those 36 sections, we overlay them to one another, and we see how well they match. What this is giving us, of course, is an indication of the rotational symmetry of the pot, how wonky or not it is. So in this principal component plot that you see here, every ellipse is one pot with its 36 sections. So you can see the difference between pots in terms of the overall shape, but you can also see for each copa, for each bowl, the variability among these various sections. Let me show you one example here. So this is a pot that you can see plots along a rather large ellipse. This is showing you that there is a lot of internal variability in the various sections of this pot. So it's a pot that is not very symmetric in terms of rotation. And you can see how this variability is explained from a pot that's a section that's tilted to this side to one that's tilted to that side. So basically, in terms of it's not very vertical, and we can see that across the 36 sections. And then the principal component 2 here, you can see this variability in the insertion of the base to the rest of the bowl. So we can not only see the disparity, the distance to centroid of those various sections, but also explain what's making them differently. We can look at another example here, another rather diverse pot, though not quite so much. And in this one, what's explaining the difference between the sections is mostly variations in the thickness of the walls. We can give you a final example here, and what we would have is a pot here. You see the ellipse is tiny, so variation is much smaller, and what we have here basically is some scattered around the mean. But if we calculate the distance to centroid, as we have been doing for this ellipse, it would be much, much smaller. So we can not only see which pots are more symmetrical than others internally, we can compare them to one another, but we can explain what the source of that morphological diversity is. And in essence, the headline is that we have a variety of skills, again, pots that between you and me, and this is probably inappropriate, are better made or more skillfully made than others. And those pots are sometimes coexisting in the same tomb. And it's to us strongly suggesting that there are not one set of objects made to be placed in a tomb by one individual or workshop, but a variety of people contributing ceramics to this particular burial deposition. And that, with the diversity of decorative techniques, diversity of motor habits, etc., is again suggestive of a diverse range of people, all of whom are exploiting local clays to produce objects that are conform to a particular highly decorated style, but not one that appears to have been made by a specialist workshop working from a single location and then selling their products or supplying them to a particular elite. So this is what I wanted to tell you about ceramics. So we've now covered those quick, superficially, inevitably case studies, but I think we can now, to finish, revisit those initial hypotheses. You may remember that was the question: how can technological systems be sustained without coercive elites and capitalist markets? The general answer is, I would argue, through collective action, through cooperation. But in revisiting our hypothesis, the first one was that to do with diversity. And I think these hypotheses, we have found strong evidence for it. Both in the goldwork and in the ceramics, we have evidence of a variety in the goldwork, a variety of raw material sources. In both cases, a variety of people involved in the making. So access to knowledge, access to technologies, access to tools is, we would argue, quite wide. And we haven't discussed much today about cross-craft interaction, but we would argue, and we have other evidence not presented today, that those craft activities were taking place in many instances in shared locations, or at least where there was a lot of fluidity in access to tools, to decorative concepts, to techniques, where once again, there must have been peripheral participation, non-specialists having a go, but these objects that today we regard as perhaps less well made, make it to the archaeological record, make it to those burial depositions in exactly the same conditions as the better made ones, if you like. So it is this diversity of sources, this diversity of shared knowledge, this wide access participation in the technologies that we think would have added resilience to it, and what would have allowed for these technologies and their surrounding systems to be sustained for centuries, as we have the evidence here. Regarding the second hypothesis, the ritual motivation, we do think this is indeed a very important factor explaining why people are sustaining these technological systems. They are not there to serve an elite. There's no evidence of that elite accumulation, of elite extraction. What there is evidence of is of communities cooperating, must have been for some kind of shared benefit. And that, I would argue, even applies to the race field systems that we found in La Mojana. There has been very interesting literature talking about the ritual ecology in these regions. And I think, of course, we shouldn't separate the ritual from the economic. This is very much a Western, modern understanding, as we separate function from style and religious from politics and so on. I think the concept of ritual ecology, as developed by Osborne, is a very useful one to understand how we are satisfying ritual needs as well as creating sustainable, ecological, and subsistent systems. And those, I think, explain as much race field agriculture as they explain the production of goldwork and ceramics. But this is something we can discuss further. I am conscious that I have covered a lot, but somewhat superficially. So it's up to you to tell me whether or not I have persuaded you that that we are in the right track. But whether or not you agree with us, I am very grateful for your invitation once again, for your attendance today, and very happy to try to answer any questions or address any comments you may have. Before that, I need to, of course, thank a very large team of people. I don't think we even have all the faces here, but what I've presented today really is the result of collective action that has been and continues to be extremely enriching and humbling, really, for me to work with such a talented and generous group of people. So thank you very much to all of them and their institutions, and thank you very much to you once again for your attention.